An evening stroll through the park became an event that shattered Evan Hale's understanding of life and death. A small girl was at the center of it all. Huddled against the wind on a cold bench sat a fragile figure. The child, no older than 7, with knees drawn to her chest and tears streaking her dirty cheeks, was a heartbreaking sight. Evan couldn't remain indifferent. Her large, frightened eyes reflected pain, and a trembling voice whispered, "I've lost my mom." Something broke inside Evan. He knew the agony of loss, of someone who should have stayed being taken away. Unable to walk past, he knelt down and said, "Don't be afraid. I'll help you find her." A small hand trustingly slipped into his, and Evan felt the weight of the child's fear. He thought he was saving a child, doing the right thing. But when they reached the house the girl called her own, and the door swung open, Evan froze. Standing on the threshold was Honora, his wife, whom he had buried a year ago. Her eyes, alive and serene, met his gaze, and she uttered words that shattered his world. "You don't belong here." Evan Hale had always considered himself a responsible man. He was a husband, a father, and a son. He worked at a carpentry shop, returning home tired but grateful, spending every evening with his beloved wife Honora and their son Caden, asleep in his room. Evan's world was simple, yet built on love. The illusion of stability crumbled on the tragic day Honora died. A drunk driver took her life as she was driving to pick up Caden from a friend's birthday party. Evan arrived at the hospital too late. Honora's skin was already cold. The memory of her hand clasped in his was forever etched in his mind like an unhealing scar. Since then, every day had become a battle for survival for his son's sake, an attempt not to drown in the grief that had settled beneath his skin. Caden was 10 now, but seemed much older than his years. He rarely cried, yet Evan noticed his son looking at pictures of his mother when he thought no one was watching. He particularly cherished a photograph of Honora holding him as a baby, her face beaming with happiness. Caden would whisper to the photo, asking unanswerable questions, wondering why she left and why God took her. Evan wished he could give his son answers, but he had none. Evan's father, Rowan, tried to support them. He lived nearby and visited almost daily, bringing food or sitting with Caden while Evan worked. Rowan was a straightforward man of strong faith. He constantly told Evan that he needed to move on, that his son needed a father, not a shadow of his former self. "You can't live with her in the grave, Evan," he had said one night when Evan was sitting on the porch. "Your son needs you alive." There was firmness in Rowan's voice, but sadness in his eyes. He too had lost his wife many years ago and knew grief. But his way of coping was to move forward, burying the pain beneath a mask of discipline and routine. Evan couldn't do that. Evan wasn't proud of the man he had become after Honora's death. He functioned, but he didn't live. He sent Caden to school, put food on the table, tried to smile, but inside there was only emptiness. Nights were the hardest. The bed felt cold and the silence was unbearable. Evan still waited for her quiet footsteps in the hall, her notes in the kitchen. But when the illusions faded, the void returned with amplified force. The death of his loved one had crushed the man with double force, like a heavy burden he was compelled to carry every day. To cope with this weight, he began taking evening walks in the park near his home. This park was an island of tranquility, with quiet paths surrounded by majestic oaks and maples. During the day, the joyous laughter of children echoed from the playground, but as dusk fell, the park descended into silence. The scent of damp earth hung in the air, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. For the man, this place became a refuge where he could breathe freely and regain his composure. He wandered the paths, pondered life, and sometimes simply sat on benches, admiring the horizon until the streetlights flickered on. Caden, his son, often asked why he preferred to walk alone. The man replied that he simply needed fresh air. However, the true reason was that he sought to revive cherished memories. Years ago, he and Honora, his wife, had walked through this park, holding hands, dreaming of the future and watching little Caden toddle ahead of them. Returning to these places brought pain, but it also allowed him to maintain a connection with Honora. He felt as though a part of her soul still lingered among these trees, and he desperately tried to sense even a shadow of her presence. Rowan, his friend, disapproved of these walks. "The park only deepens your grief." You need to stop living in the past, he would say with disappointment in his voice. Yet, Rowan didn't understand that the past was the only place where the man could still see his beloved wife. On the evening everything changed. He left his house with a heavy heart. Caden was already asleep, clutching his mother's old scarf like a lifeline. The man tucked him in, whispered, "Good night," and stepped out into the cool air. The streets were quiet, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. He headed to the park, as he had countless times before, expecting nothing but silence and the steady rhythm of his own footsteps. He had no idea this night would be different from all the others. He didn't know that in the shadows of that park, a little girl awaited him, whose appearance would overturn all his perceptions of grief, love, and the finality of death. That evening, silence reigned in the park. A cool breeze swept across the open field, carrying the scent of damp leaves and freshly cut grass. The swings on the playground swayed gently, though no one was nearby. The man walked along his usual path, hands in his jacket pockets, head down. His thoughts were consumed by memories of Honora. This had become his routine, and in this repetition he found a semblance of comfort. Suddenly, he heard a sound. At first it was so faint that the man thought he had imagined it, a broken sound, carried on a gust of wind. He stopped and listened. Again, a soft cry, high-pitched and trembling, a child's cry. His body tensed, and he scanned the path ahead. The sound grew clearer, desperate and quiet, and the man followed it, past the swings to a wooden bench by the pond. There he saw her. A little girl sat curled up against the armrest of the bench, her arms tightly wrapped around her knees. Her shoulders shook with sobs, and her face was hidden in her lap. Her clothes seemed too light for the evening chill. A pale dress clung to her fragile body, and her shoes were scuffed and wet. When she sensed his presence, she lifted her head, and the man saw her wide, glistening eyes in the dim light. His heart ached. The girl looked so small and defenseless, and her trembling body touched something deep within him. She reminded him of Caden as a child, climbing into their bed after a nightmare, clinging to him or Honora for protection. He couldn't just walk past this child. The man slowly approached her, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Hey," he said softly, his calm voice carrying in the still air. "It's okay. Are you hurt?" The girl shook her head but said nothing. Her lips trembled, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mara," she whispered so faintly he barely heard her. "That's a beautiful name," the man said. "Mara, why are you all alone out here?" The girl gasped and replied, "I can't find my mom." Her words pierced his heart. No child should be wandering alone at night, lost and afraid. He crouched down to be at her eye level. "Where did you last see her?" The girl vaguely pointed towards the street beyond the trees. "She told me to wait, but she didn't come back. I waited and waited." Her voice trembled and tears welled up again. The man felt a lump in his throat. "You must be cold," he said. "Come on, I'll help you get home." Mara hesitated, looking at him with her tear-filled eyes, as if trying to discern if he could be trusted. Finally, she extended her small hand. It was icy cold as it slipped into his palm. The man's heart ached with pity, and he gently squeezed her hand. "I promise I'll take you to your mom," he said firmly. "You're not alone anymore." The girl nodded, trusting him as only a child can. The man and the little girl, who seemed no older than 7, walked along the winding paths of the park, her small hand clutching his. The girl appeared to seek protection, pressing closer, her steps hurried and nervous. To reassure her, the man spoke. "How old are you, Mara?" 7, she replied, her voice already less anxious. "And where do you live?" She pointed towards the houses visible beyond the trees. "Over there, I know the way." And he allowed her to lead him. The houses looked familiar, small, with cozy porches and dimly lit windows. The man thought he knew the neighborhood well, but an inexplicable sense of dread began to stir within him as they walked further. The streets grew quieter and emptier until Mara slowed her pace and finally tugged on his hand. "This one," she said, pointing to a house with pale blue siding and a light burning above the door. The man froze. He recognized that house. His heart pounded as he stared at the windows, the porch, and the railings where the paint had chipped. This was the house where all his dreams had once lived. His throat went dry. It was his house. Swallowing hard, he tried to regain his breath. Mara looked up at him hopefully, her face expectant. "Mommy's inside," she said with quiet certainty. Fragments of thought raced through the man's mind. He knew this was impossible. The house had been empty since Honora died. After the funeral, he couldn't bear to stay there, so he and Caden had moved to a smaller house closer to his father. The old house stood quiet and untouched, yet here he was, holding the hand of a girl who called it home. Instinct screamed that something was wrong. He tightened his grip on Mara's hand. He could turn around right now. He could take her to the police station for them to handle, and never know what lay beyond that door. But the girl's eyes pleaded with him, full of trust. He had promised her he would take her home. The porch steps creaked under their weight as they ascended. His legs felt like lead, and fear settled in his chest. Mara tugged impatiently at his hand, her voice becoming insistent. "Please, she's in there. Please knock." The man raised his hand to the door, his heart hammered, ready to burst from his chest. He hesitated, paralyzed by fear and obligation. The promise he made to Mara echoed in his mind, urging him forward. Finally, he knocked his knuckles against the wood. The sound was sharp and definitive, and in the ensuing silence the world seemed to hold its breath. The doorknob turned. The sound of the latch clicking sent a shiver through his body. Every nerve screamed for him to run, to grab Mara and leave before the door opened, but his feet wouldn't move. He stood, rooted to the porch, still holding her hand. Her grip was firm, not frightened as before, but eager, as if she already saw her mother waiting on the other side. The door creaked open an inch, spilling warm light into the night. His throat was dry. He had approached this porch hundreds of times when it was his home. He had opened this very door with groceries in his arms, with Caden bouncing beside him, with Honora smiling and inviting them in. Now, after a year of desolation, he expected to see only emptiness. But the light indicated someone was there. Someone was living in the place he had left to die. The gap widened and he saw the outline of a figure. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would break his ribs. He wanted to turn, to pull Mara away, but her soft voice cut through the storm in his head. "Mommy," she whispered. The man froze. The word plunged deep into his consciousness. The figure came into view. For a moment he thought he had gone insane. It was her, Honora, his wife. The woman he had buried a year ago stood in the doorway, alive, her eyes serene, her hair as he remembered it, her features untouched by time or death. His knees buckled. He had imagined her face so many nights that at first he believed it was another cruel vision. But Mara released his hand and rushed into her arms, colliding with her in a cry of joy. The sound was real. The embrace was real. He could not deny what he saw. Honora was here. She was alive. The world around him spun. His breathing became ragged. He wanted to speak, to shout her name, to demand answers, but no words would come. Memories of the funeral, the coffin, the dirt falling onto the wood flooded his mind. He had seen her body. He had touched her cold skin. How could she be here? Could she truly be there? Honora's gaze briefly met Evan's, piercing him over Mara's head. The warmth that once brought him peace was gone. Now, her eyes held detachment, wariness. Pressing Mara close, she whispered something in her ear, then gently set the girl down. Mara, clinging to Honora's dress, looked at Evan with confusion. Honora stepped forward and stopped at the threshold, placing a hand on the doorframe. Her voice was calm and steady, but every word struck like a dagger. "You shouldn't be here." Those words hit Evan harder than physical pain. No question of how he was, no admission that she had missed him. Not even his name was spoken, only a warning, a rejection. Evan's hands trembled. "What does this mean?" he choked out. "Honora, is that really you?" Her eyes did not soften. "Take your son and leave, Evan. This isn't your home anymore." Evan recoiled, confusion and anger mingling with the pain in his chest. "Leave? I buried you. I mourned you every single day, and now you stand here with a child who calls you mother. How am I supposed to understand this?" Mara's gaze flickered between them, her small face contorted with fear, her grip on Honora's dress tightening. Honora looked down at the girl, gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, then looked back at Evan. "You promised to bring her home. You kept your promise. That's all that's required of you." Her words were a dismissal, a door slamming shut, but Evan couldn't leave. "Caden still cries for you," he said, his voice breaking. "He talks to your pictures. He asks where you are. You're his mother. How can you say this isn't our home?" For the first time, a shadow flickered in her eyes. A flash of pain she quickly tried to hide. She clutched the doorframe as if seeking support. "I can't explain now. If you love our son, don't bring him here." Evan's entire body trembled. He wanted to push her aside, to rush into the house and demand answers, but the weight of her gaze kept him rooted. It was the same strength that had always kept him from reckless acts, the same calmness that balanced his impulses. But now, that strength was turned against him. Mara tugged on Honora's hand and whispered, "Mommy, who is that?" Honora knelt down and pressed her forehead to her daughter's. "No one you need to be afraid of," she replied softly. Then she stood again, turning to Evan with an unreadable expression. He opened his mouth to speak, but the door began to close. Slowly, deliberately, it cut him off from the light, leaving only the dim porch light above. The final click of the lock echoed in the night silence. Evan's hands fell to his sides, useless. His legs felt like lead. Part of him wanted to collapse on the porch and scream until the neighbors came running. Another wanted to break down the door, but he did neither. Stumbling, he descended the steps, his breath ragged, his heart pounding. He had promised Mara he would bring her home, and he had. But what awaited beyond that door was beyond his comprehension. Honora was alive. She had a child who called her mother, and she had made it clear with a look he would never forget that he didn't belong there. That night, he left the house that had once been his sanctuary, his mind crumbling with every step. He didn't know what hurt more, that Honora was alive or that she no longer wanted him in her life. He left the porch in a daze, his steps uncertain, as if the ground were shifting beneath his feet. The world felt unreal. The streetlights shone too brightly. Every shadow seemed to breathe, and the sound of his own heartbeat drowned out the neighborhood's silence. Honora was alive. He had seen her with his own eyes. He had touched her hand when they married, held her when she died. And here he was, seeing her embrace a child who called her mother. Nothing in his life had prepared him for this. What had transpired was completely unexpected for him. He stood frozen in the middle of the street, glancing back at the house he had just left. The porch light still touched the steps where he had stood moments ago. Behind that door was the woman he loved more than anything. She had said he didn't belong there, yet a burning desire for answers outweighed his fear. He couldn't just leave, not this time. Turning around, he took a heavy but resolute step back, clenching his fists at his sides. He wouldn't leave until he understood everything. Back on the porch, he touched the wooden door with his palm. It felt warm, the heat from inside seeping out. His breathing quickened. Before doubt could stop him, he knocked again. The silence stretched so long that he began to think she would simply ignore him. But the door cracked open again, just slightly this time. Honora stood in the opening, her face strained, her voice sharp as steel. "Evan, you should have left." He swallowed hard. "No, not until you explain what's happening. You owe me that. I buried you. I was crushed by grief. Caden cries for you every night, and you're here, alive. Tell me the truth." Her jaw tightened. Behind her he noticed Mara, standing in the hallway, her small hand clutching the wall. Her eyes were wide. The sight of the girl brought him a fresh pang of pain. If Mara was her daughter, it meant Honora had secretly built a new life. But how was that possible if he had witnessed her funeral? Honora stepped onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind her so Mara couldn't hear. The tension between them was palpable. She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes glistening, but her voice remained firm. "You shouldn't have come here, Evan. My life ended the day of that accident. What you buried was real, but it wasn't the whole truth. I was given a chance to start over, away from the world we knew. You weren't meant to know." Her words sent a shiver through him. "Who gave you this chance? What does that mean?" She looked away, gazing down the street as if fearing someone might overhear. "I can't explain everything. All I can say is that Mara is my daughter now, my responsibility. My life is here and yours is with Caden. If you bring him into this, if you try to bring me back, it will destroy everything." Tears welled in his eyes. "Destroy what?" "A lie. Do you have any idea what it was like for me, for our son, to live without you, to believe you were dead? and now you're saying you chose this, that you chose to leave us." For the first time, her composure faltered. Her lips trembled, her hands dropped and shook. "Do you think it was easy for me to watch from afar, to hear Caden cry and not be able to hold him? I died that night, Evan. What you see now is something different. I'm no longer the wife you lost, not the mother he remembers. I can't be her again." Her words devastated him. She stood right before him, alive, her breath visible in the night air, her voice trembling with emotion. Yet she claimed she was no longer his, no longer Caden's. The love of his life had become a phantom, wearing her face, her flesh and blood, but unreachable. He stepped closer, his voice breaking. "Then tell me this, Honora. Look me in the eyes and tell me you don't love us anymore. Tell me you don't love your son." Finally, her tears fell. She shook her head, unable to speak, then whispered, "I love him more than anything. That's why I can't come back. He needs a father who is always there, not a mother tied to a world that no longer belongs to her." The truth crushed him. She was alive, but still lost to them. Mara opened the door, and her clear voice rang out into the night. "Mommy, please come home." Honora quickly wiped her face and turned to him one last time. "Go home, Evan. Tell Caden I love him. That has to be enough." She stepped inside, the door closed firmly, and the latch clicked shut. The lock clicked softly into place. Left utterly alone on the porch, he felt a fine tremor in his fists, his breath hitched, and his heart tore apart with a force he never knew it possessed. This time, he retreated slowly, each subsequent step impossibly heavy. The night air felt piercingly cold, the street endlessly long, and the weight of her words pressed down on him with such power that he feared being crushed. His wife was alive. She had confessed her love for their son but stated she had no intention of returning. He had found her, only to lose her again immediately, and in the ensuing silence the bitter truth sank in. What he had witnessed that night would irrevocably change everything. Not just his own life, but the fate of Caden, Mara, and the entire world order he had previously considered immutable. The sleepless night dragged on agonizingly. He sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, replaying every word Honora had spoken over and over. Her voice echoed in his mind like a persistent melody he couldn't shake. "You don't belong here. This isn't your home anymore. Tell Caden I love him." He desperately wanted to believe it was all a nightmare, that grief had finally stolen his sanity. But the harsh reality was that it had truly happened. He had seen her alive. His hand had touched the doorknob she stood behind. He had heard her daughter call her mother. Time crawled by at an unbearable pace. He mechanically poured himself coffee he couldn't bring himself to drink. He stared at her scarf, clutched in Caden's arms as he slept, trying to discern if even a fragment of her soul remained on it. Every memory of their life together now resurfaced with vivid intensity, for he knew she was out there somewhere, breathing, laughing, and living in a world that no longer had a place for him or their son. At dawn, Caden, rubbing his eyes sleepily, quietly entered the kitchen. In the morning light, his face looked pale. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked. He forced a semblance of a smile. "I'm fine, buddy, just couldn't sleep." His son sat at the table across from him, still clutching his mother's scarf. "I dreamed about Mom again," he whispered. "She said she loves me." His heart ached at those words, but he managed only a nod in response. "She really does love you, Caden. More than anything." The boy offered a faint smile, satisfied with the answer, and immediately turned his attention to the bowl of cereal his father had placed before him. Watching his son eat, so young yet already burdened by grief, he made a firm decision. He wouldn't tell him what he had seen, not yet at least. How could he burden him with the truth that his mother was alive but unreachable, alive but unwilling to return to them? That knowledge wouldn't bring him healing, it would only break him. Later that day, Rowan arrived. He exuded confidence as always, his gait firm, his voice calm. "You look terrible, son," he remarked, pulling up a chair. "Rough night?" He stared at him for a long moment, wondering whether to open up and tell him everything that had happened, but he knew exactly what the response would be. Rowan would say he had imagined it all, that grief had clouded his mind, or even worse, he would believe him and insist on breaking into that house to bring Honora back into their lives, despite her unwillingness. Neither option would bring relief. So, he decided to remain silent. "Just couldn't sleep," he mumbled. Rowan scrutinized him, his eyes narrowed but didn't press further. He simply clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hang in there, Evan. One step at a time. That's the only way to survive." That phrase haunted him all day. One step at a time. But how do you take those steps when the ground beneath your feet has completely changed? How do you live on when the woman he had mourned, the woman he loved beyond measure, declared she belonged to a life that had no room for him? That night, he returned to the park again, as if drawn there by an invisible force. He stood near the bench where he had first met Mara. The wood was damp with evening dew, and the pond's surface rippled under the moonlight. The memory of her small, trembling hand in his made his heart ache. Somewhere not far from where he stood, Honora was tucking a little girl into bed, whispering "good night," just as she once had to Caden. He wondered if she thought of them at that moment, if her heart was tearing apart. Then it dawned on him that grief doesn't end with the death of a loved one. Sometimes grief begins anew when you discover they are still alive, yet lost to you in another, equally painful way. And in that bitter truth, he found his lesson. He couldn't continue to chase ghosts, even if they were flesh and blood. He had to live for his son, who depended entirely on him. The weight of responsibility pressed on his shoulders as he slowly walked home. Opening the door, he saw Caden waiting for him on the couch. The boy's wide, innocent eyes held the same curiosity that Honora's once had. "Where did you go?" he asked. A soft smile touched his lips as he knelt before his son. "I just went for a walk. But now I'm here, and I'll always be here." Caden nodded trustingly, leaning his head against his father's chest. In that moment, the true value became clear. Honora couldn't be brought back, but he could give Caden what he needed most, himself, completely and wholly, unbroken, ready to guide him through all of life's challenges. The mystery of that night would forever remain with him. He didn't know how Honora had survived, why she chose a life away from them, or what forces granted her this chance. Perhaps someday the truth would be revealed. But for now, he could only keep the promise he made to his son, to live, to love him without reservation, and never to let him feel abandoned. And if there was a lesson he hoped you would take from his story, it was the realization that life can deliver blows beyond imagination. But the people who remain by your side, those are the ones to cherish and love with all your heart.